The world rarely notices when the ground beneath global power begins to shift, but in Africa, that tremor has already started. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, has taken a bold step that is echoing far beyond his nation's borders. A $2.1 billion trade pivot, an economic maneuver that no one saw coming, has not only broken decades of dependency, but also struck at the heart of America's long-standing influence in Africa. The question is no longer whether this move will change the balance of power, but how quickly the ripple will spread. And the answer may shake the world order itself. For decades, Africa has been treated as a playground for global powers. Nations rich in resources were often left in poverty, their wealth flowing outward to feed foreign economies. The United States, through aid programs, military bases, and trade deals, maintained a strong grip over many African nations, ensuring dependency while presenting it as partnership. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country in West Africa, was long considered too fragile to challenge this arrangement. Its economy relied heavily on foreign aid. Its institutions were pressured into alignment with Western interests, and its leadership was often shaped by outside influence. But then came Ibrahim Traoré. Rising to power in his early 30s, he represented a new generation of African leadership, bold, unapologetic, and unwilling to remain chained to history. He spoke openly about sovereignty, the right to self-determination, and the need for Africa to chart its own path. Critics dismissed him as naive, too young, too radical to make lasting change. Yet in the shadows of political skepticism, Traoré was quietly building something no one expected, a complete economic redirection. The $2.1 billion trade pivot was not just a policy, it was a statement. Instead of channeling Burkina Faso's gold, cotton, and agricultural exports into Western markets as tradition dictated, Traoré sought new partners in Asia, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. The strategy was simple but radical. Stop feeding the same cycle of dependency and begin forging alliances that recognized Africa as an equal, not a subordinate. What made this move even more shocking was its speed. While most leaders take years to negotiate trade agreements, Traoré orchestrated this pivot in under 12 months. And as the contracts were signed, it became clear. Burkina Faso was no longer playing by America's rules. The announcement of Traoré's $2.1 billion trade pivot sent shockwaves across the global stage. For many outside Africa, Burkina Faso had been little more than a name on the map, overshadowed by larger economies like Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt. Yet suddenly, this small nation had become the epicenter of a geopolitical storm. The deals Traoré signed weren't just numbers on paper, they represented a new vision of power in Africa. First, he forged an unexpected alliance with Asian markets, securing long-term contracts for Burkina Faso's gold and cotton at higher, fairer prices than the West had ever offered. Next, he turned to the Middle East, negotiating energy partnerships that promised cheaper fuel imports and infrastructure investments. But perhaps the most revolutionary step came when he prioritized intra-African trade. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso's exports weren't being shipped out across oceans. They were flowing into neighboring African nations, strengthening bonds that had been deliberately weakened by colonial borders and foreign interference. This pivot sent a clear message. Africa didn't have to depend on America or Europe to survive. It could stand on its own feet. But not everyone welcomed this change. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats began to pressure Traoré, warning of consequences if he strayed too far from Washington's orbit. Think tanks and media outlets started painting him as a dictator in the making, questioning his legitimacy and highlighting instability within Burkina Faso. Economic sanctions were whispered about, and international financial institutions suddenly became reluctant to support his initiatives. Yet, inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was electric. For the first time, farmers felt their harvests were being valued. Miners saw profits staying in their communities instead of vanishing abroad. Young entrepreneurs, inspired by the bold shift, began exploring new business ventures tied to African markets rather than chasing opportunities overseas. The people felt dignity returning, and with it, a dangerous kind of hope. The United States, long accustomed to dictating the tempo of African trade, began to see its grip loosen. Washington's influence had always relied on two pillars: economic leverage and military presence. But Traoré's pivot targeted the first pillar directly. Without the flow of cheap African resources, American corporations faced higher costs. Without guaranteed trade dominance, Washington's ability to dictate policy in the region weakened. By the second year of the pivot, neighboring African leaders started taking notice. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, already leaning toward regional independence, expressed interest in joining similar agreements. The dream of a self-sufficient Africa, long buried under centuries of exploitation, seemed to stir awake once more. Yet history had shown that such moves never went unchallenged. Each time an African leader dared to defy global powers, consequences followed, be it sanctions, coups, or worse. Traoré knew this, and so did his people. As the $2.1 billion pivot gained momentum, tension thickened in the air. Was Burkina Faso about to lead Africa into a new era of independence or walk straight into the storm of retaliation? The turning point came swiftly and brutally. As Traoré's $2.1 billion trade pivot gained international traction, the backlash from global powers moved from whispers to direct action. Western media outlets flooded the airwaves with alarming reports, painting Burkina Faso as unstable, unsafe, and unfit for investment. International organizations, once silent, suddenly raised concerns about human rights violations and democratic principles. To the outside world, this might have seemed coincidental, but to the people of Burkina Faso, the timing was too perfect, too deliberate. Then came the economic strikes. Aid packages were slashed, loans delayed, and sanctions quietly introduced. International banks froze assets linked to Burkinabe companies involved in the new trade deals. Cargo ships carrying vital imports mysteriously stalled at foreign ports. What was once celebrated as a bold step toward independence now looked like the opening moves of an economic war. Inside Burkina Faso, fear mingled with determination. Farmers who had begun to taste the fruits of independence watched nervously as prices fluctuated. Traders who once praised Traoré whispered about shortages. Opposition figures, some with suspicious ties abroad, amplified discontent, urging the nation to return to the old partnerships. It seemed the entire weight of the global system had turned against one small West African country. But Traoré did not back down. In a fiery address, he told his people that every sacrifice made was part of a larger fight, a fight for dignity, for sovereignty, for the right to decide their own future. His words sparked massive demonstrations of support. Crowds filled the streets waving the national flag, chanting for independence, vowing to endure whatever storms lay ahead. The climax was not just political, it was emotional. For the first time in generations, Burkina Faso stood at the crossroads of destiny, unafraid to confront the powers that had long dictated its fate. Traoré's gamble had shaken the global order, but now the question loomed. Could his nation withstand the storm that was fast approaching? The storm did not pass quietly. In the months following Traoré's trade pivot, Burkina Faso endured one of the most challenging chapters in its modern history. Economic blockades tightened, foreign investors fled, and Western media continued to frame the young leader as a destabilizing figure. Yet, instead of collapsing, the country adapted. Communities turned inward, relying more heavily on local resources and regional partners. Farmers pooled together to strengthen cooperatives, ensuring food supply chains remained stable. Neighboring African nations, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, stepped in with mutual trade agreements, defying external pressure. Slowly, what was meant to isolate Burkina Faso became the seed of something bigger, a new economic alliance among African states determined to break free from dependency. On the global stage, analysts admitted what few wanted to say out loud. The $2.1 billion trade pivot had shifted the narrative. America's grip, once unquestionable, was no longer absolute. The story of one small nation defying the odds inspired debates across the continent. Could this be the model for Africa's future? Was it possible that the cycle of exploitation could finally be broken? For Traoré's people, the impact was deeply personal. While sacrifices were real, higher prices, shortages, and uncertainty, the sense of dignity outweighed the hardship. No longer did they feel like passive participants in their own destiny. They were active shapers of a new chapter, one where African voices carried weight in global affairs. The resolution was not one of complete victory, nor of defeat. Instead, it was the birth of a movement. Traoré's defiance had cracked the foundations of a system built over centuries, and though retaliation had been fierce, it revealed something even more powerful, that the balance of power could indeed be challenged. In the end, the trade pivot was more than numbers, deals, or contracts. It was a message carved into history that even the smallest nations can shift the tide of empires when they refuse to bow. And that message continues to echo far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, forcing the world to ask itself, is Africa finally writing its own destiny? The ripple effects of Traoré's pivot spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Washington, policymakers scrambled to assess the damage. For decades, America had relied on African resources to fuel its industries and maintain leverage in global trade negotiations. Now, with even a small nation daring to walk away, the illusion of unshakable dominance began to crack. Across Africa, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea openly praised Traoré's courage, signing joint declarations that emphasized economic independence and regional unity. Even larger nations, such as South Africa and Nigeria, began reconsidering their reliance on Western-dominated trade channels. The possibility of an African economic bloc, once dismissed as a dream, suddenly felt within reach. In Europe, the reaction was mixed. Some governments expressed alarm at losing influence in Africa, while others recognized opportunity. Countries facing energy crises saw in Traoré's pivot a chance to negotiate directly with African states, bypassing traditional American-led systems. Meanwhile, China and Russia seized the opening, accelerating partnerships and investments, eager to position themselves as Africa's trusted allies. For ordinary Africans, the aftermath was more emotional than geopolitical. Conversations shifted. Instead of quietly accepting dependency as the natural order, people began asking harder questions. Why should our gold, oil, and crops enrich others while our children remain in poverty? Why must our leaders beg for aid when we hold the world's resources beneath our feet? But the most profound repercussion was psychological. Traoré's pivot ignited a fire of possibility. Even nations not directly involved in his trade deals began exploring alternative financial systems, new trade corridors, and stronger regional cooperation. The West still held immense power, but it was no longer unquestioned. Burkina Faso had proven that resistance was not only possible, but contagious. And while America and its allies scrambled to regain control, one truth was undeniable. The narrative of Africa as a dependent continent was broken. The question now was not whether others would follow, but how soon. Years after the $2.1 billion pivot, the story of Burkina Faso continued to echo across Africa and beyond. What had started as a daring gamble by a young leader transformed into a symbol of possibility. Even though Burkina Faso faced challenges, economic sanctions, infrastructure hurdles, and political pressures, the seed of change had been planted. Across the continent, leaders began rethinking the cost of dependency. New regional trade corridors opened, connecting landlocked nations to coastal ports without relying solely on Western intermediaries. Pan-African institutions, once weak and fragmented, started to gain credibility as nations poured more energy into cooperation. Conversations about sovereignty were no longer reserved for academic halls. They became part of daily life, from rural villages to bustling cities. For the youth of Africa, Traoré's defiance offered something priceless: hope. No longer was the idea of independence a relic of past liberation struggles. It was alive, modern, and achievable. Young entrepreneurs envisioned a future where Africa could process its own raw materials, design its own technologies, and sell to its own people before exporting abroad. The long-term impact was not merely economic, it was cultural. Globally, the balance of power shifted slowly but noticeably. America and its allies remained influential, but their monopoly over African trade eroded. Competing powers like China, Russia, and emerging economies stepped in, eager to forge partnerships. For the first time in centuries, Africa found itself not as a subject of global competition, but as a player capable of choosing its alliances. Reflection came with a sobering truth. Traoré's pivot did not magically solve Africa's struggles. Poverty, corruption, and internal conflicts remained obstacles. But it proved that one nation, even a small one, could challenge entrenched systems and inspire others to follow. That lesson alone carried immeasurable weight. In the long arc of history, the pivot would not be remembered simply as a trade deal. It would be remembered as the spark of a new era. A reminder that change is not given, but taken, and that Africa's destiny, long written by others, could finally be written by Africans themselves. In the end, Traoré's $2.1 billion trade pivot was more than a financial move. It was a declaration. It declared that Africa was no longer content with being the silent supplier of the world's wealth, nor the passive receiver of foreign aid disguised as generosity. It declared that even the smallest nations could break the chains of dependency when led by courage rather than fear. The world may remember the sanctions, the backlash, and the storm that followed. But the people of Africa will remember something greater. The moment one of their own dared to challenge the system and refused to bow. The moment hope returned, not as a dream, but as a strategy. For the United States, the pivot was a warning that influence built on exploitation can crumble overnight. For Africa, it was an awakening that unity, sovereignty, and self-reliance are not fantasies, but choices. And for the rest of the world, it was a reminder that power is never permanent. It shifts, it bends, and sometimes it breaks. So the question remains, when the history of this century is written, will Traoré's pivot be remembered as the spark that ignited Africa's rise, or as the warning the world failed to heed? The answer does not lie in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow. It lies in the hands of Africans themselves. Because the truth is simple, the future of Africa will no longer be decided for it. It will be decided by it.